You've heard me talk about a lot of nonsense on this channel, but have you heard me do a whole tutorial about arrows from start to finish? Probably not. So today I'm going to show you how to make some procedurally glowing arrows because I use them for the Tenet VFX thing that I made over at the CG Matter channel, so I thought why not make a tutorial on this. It's not a waste of time, you're going to learn quite a bit, so follow very closely. I'm going to be using Blender version 2.9, you can use 2.8, whatever the fuck, I don't really care. Point is, we're going to go to the top view, delete the cube, and replace this with a plane. Why? Because we want to be going two-dimensionally so we can model our arrow and then do the shading. To model this arrow, probably the fastest way to do it, but I'm not a good modeler, I'd imagine it's to make like the lengthy part of the arrow, everything except the triangle, and then at the end you just select an edge being the right one, in this case extrude, and then if you select these two edges, extrude by right-clicking to reset it to 0, so you've extruded but kind of canceled it somehow. Once you do that, you can scale on the y-axis, so you wouldn't be able to do this otherwise, and then we're just going to take these vertices all the way over here and scale them together by 0. That's probably the fastest way to do this, and you can then customize the size of the triangle and the size of the leg and all that. Probably the fastest way to make an arrow. I'm not a pro modeler. Comment below if I'm an idiot. Either way, we've done the arrow, and now we just need to do the procedural shading, which is what's going to make it glow and kind of look like it's pulsing from side to side. So, shading workspace, this is where the magic happens. I'm going to go into rendered mode since we want to make sure we're seeing that Eevee bloom and everything. Speaking of which, let's actually set this up before we make our material. Background color, I'm going to set it to black so that it's not distracting and we don't need any light illumination on our object. We're not using BSDFs. And then in the render tab, we can also make sure this is Eevee and make sure that bloom is enabled. That is very important. Okay, for the material, we're going to do something super basic. So if you're not confident with materials, I'll hold your hand. I'm going to grip it so tight. You're not going to have any freedom to explore around because I'm just going to give you the perfect solution for this. So don't worry. What we're going to do is instead of the BSDF texture coordinates, connect a generated coordinates, or you can use object coordinates, but the math is a bit simpler with generated. We are going to take this, separate it by components, since we are only interested in this X component going from left to right, which, if you don't really know what I'm talking about, it becomes more obvious when I add in a math node. You can see we can kind of control which part of the arrow, at least along the X-axis, we're dealing with. Of course, you could instead you could have this be done with the Y-axis, which doesn't really make much sense in the context of what we're trying to do. So X-axis stuff, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this to put in a driver for what it is that we are going to be adding. So hash is a fast way to do it. Hash frame is going to make a driver. So right now we're on frame 1, so it has a addition of 1, then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and it gets brighter and brighter and brighter as we go along. This is fine. It's not necessarily what we want. We want it to pulse from left to right, and the idea of how we're going to do this is by adding in a amount every single frame. We can then use a periodic function to make weird stuff happen. So what's a periodic function? Well, there's a couple. There's the trigonometric function, sine, cosine, other stuff. I recommend fraction. It's pretty easy. It takes a number and only keeps the decimal. So 2.3 becomes 0.3, 4.75 becomes 0.75, etc. So it's 0 to 1 periodic, which means if we now take this driver, not make it the frame, but maybe the frame divided by 20. So instead of going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it's like 0.05, 0.1, etc. You can see now we have this pulsing arrow where the kind of speed of this pulsing is determined by this division. So if I divide it by a bigger number, it's going to go much slower, although it seems like I've typed something wrong. So divided by 50 goes much slower. You divide by 100, it's going to go even slower. The one key on my keyboard, I jammed it and I can't hit it very well. I guess I should probably fix that. You can also divide by a negative number to have it go the other direction. So now it's going negative 15 in the other direction, etc. You understand what's going on. So I'm just going to stick with negative 30. So it's going left to right at a somewhat slow speed. Kind of one of the last things we need to do is not make the cutoff so harsh. So it goes exactly from 0 to 1 and then it repeats. So white, 1, and 0, black are right next to each other. It's a very harsh transition. It's discontinuous. A way we can fix this is just use a color ramp node, or you could use some fancy math. But with a color ramp node, we can make 0 and 1, the two opposite ends, the same color being white, for example, and then in between, where there is no harsh jump from one to the other, just pick a different color, like a darker black. So now you can see we have this pulsing, but it's not as intense, which means we can now that we have kind of the base node group set up, we just pick a color using Mix RGB. I set it to multiply because the math makes sense, and then pick a color like red. At this point, we can pick whatever color it is that we want for our pulsing arrow. We can also determine how intense this gradient is. is by making this less black, or you can actually turn the interpolation type to something like Bezier, if I can find it, B-spline maybe. So this makes it still happen, but it's somewhat more subtle, which will look even cooler when it's glowing. And then you can use this division, whatever you're dividing by, to control the flow, the rate of pulsing. And then finally, to make this glow, what do we do? At the very end, instead of plugging this in directly, we are just gonna send this through a emission, which we can just make as strong as we want. Again, if you don't see it like this, make sure your bloom is enabled. If we make this gradient harsher, only some areas will be glowing and some not at all. And fun fact, instead of this emission BSDF, I think technically Blender assumes there's always an emission, at least with strength 1. So if you were to multiply this by like a crazy number like RGB, I don't know if you could set this to 10, it does the same thing. Just a little thing for the people who already know what's going on with this, so you could take a little something away. This is how I made my glowing arrow. Is it the most Is it the most confusing thing in the world? No, but it is a quick effect that you can use to make any object pulse from left to right as if energy is being dispersed through it in any direction. I hope you learned something in this tutorial, because that's it. That's the show. See ya.